So both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system have both neuroglia and then neurons. The word neuroglia comes from the phrase nerve glue, so glia meaning glue. This was thought to be something that's kind of more of a supportive role, but as we learn more about the mechanisms that these guys operate on, that's kind of become a misnomer over time. So neuroglia are not just supporting cells for neurons. Neuroglia have very specific roles and functions. And the first one that we're going to talk about are called astrocytes. So anything that has the word cyte to it, this means cell. And in this context, astro, we're literally talking about a star because they kind of look like stars, apparently. They're the most abundant glial cells of the central nervous system. I believe they outnumber neurons. I think it was like 10 to 1. Crazy numbers here. And the reason why is because they do a lot of jobs. They have a lot of regulatory work, but they also have a lot of other functions that we're just now starting to learn about. So what we know really well is that they play a huge role in controlling the capillary permeability. And that capillary exchange it's almost as if it were a mediator between the capillary and then the neuron themselves. One of the things that we're also discovering is that, and that's why I'm kind of mentioning it down here with the lactate shuffling and metabolic support, they play a large role in determining what reaches the neurons. They also are predominantly playing a large role as an inducer for neuron development and synapse formation. They're secreting a lot of cytokines, a lot of chemical messengers to act upon the neurons. And then this was something that I don't really know if this is the case. The article that I had read about that it was a reference to was kind of old, but it says that they may be able to differentiate into neurons. That I don't really want to say definitively, but it's a possibility. This is the nervous system. This is where you're going to start to see the words may being used a lot in your textbook. So astrocytes may be able to differentiate into neurons. But we know that it definitely plays a large role in this, in controlling the extracellular fluid environment. So when we have something called an action potential firing, which is basically just an electrical current, which we generate that with literally salt, sodium ions, and other ions as well, they're cleaned up by these things called astrocytes. So they play a large role in maintaining the extracellular fluid environment. They're connected in groups by gap junctions, and what gap junctions are really good for is whenever an ion needs to pass from one cell to the next, it just goes straight through rather than having to deal with any, secondary signaling processes here. So they really do work collectively as a team. They're not just individual astrocytes doing one thing at a time. As we mentioned earlier, they control and they can actually receive nerve impulses, which kind of hints to the idea that they may be able to differentiate into neurons. And then, like I'd also mentioned, they play a large role in metabolic support for the neurons themselves. Neurons can only make ATP by the use of by the use of oxygen and glucose. So if there's any type of a metabolic byproducts that we need to get rid of or get into the bloodstream or take from the bloodstream, astrocytes are going to play a role in that. And this is just the roles that we know about. If they outnumber neurons 10 to 1, chances are they have a lot of functions that we probably haven't even discovered yet. So the next one, and I have to talk about these because I'm a huge immunology guy. I want to investigate how the immune system affects the central nervous system. But anyways, the glial cells known as microglia, and I don't like this terminology because microglia, but they're also macrophages. So yes, they're the big eaters, if you could call them. They play a huge role in pathogen defense, along with the help of CD4 helper T cells. Now, if you watch any of my immunology videos, B cells, they don't really get cross the blood-brain barrier. Even in a state of inflammation, B cells don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And antibodies aren't really absorbed that much in large enough quantities in the cerebrospinal fluid. So if you have, say, a good example would be a toxoplasmosis infection. That's going to be taken care of by these guys and then CD4 helper T cells. So basically with inflammation. But one of the things that I didn't really get to talk much about in my immunology videos is that macrophages and helper T cells both play a huge role in not only inflammation, but in the process of healing and initiating growth and repair. So yeah, also just going back to this, that's what the MHC type 2 is for. But whenever I mentioned my immunology videos, in any part of your body, there's a specific macrophage that's involved with that specific region, right? There's a specific macrophage that lives in your skin, a specific macrophage that lives in your liver, and in this context, this is the specific macrophage that lives in your central nervous system. And this is incredibly important with a lot of what we're finding out with a lot of diseases like Alzheimer's or Lou Gehrig's disease or Parkinson's disease. A lot of these have to do with inflammatory pathways. I'll put a link to a guy named Gregory Pesto, I think is what his name is, over at Cornell. He did an iBiology podcast quite recently, in fact. It was awesome. You should check it out. So the next one that are known as ependymal cells. I should also make a note that all of these glial cells that I'm mentioning, these guys are mitotic. They can reproduce and they can divide and all that jazz. But the ependymal cells, as you can see here, are ciliated. So they play a large role in production and then moving of this stuff called cerebrospinal fluid. That's kind of analogous to plasma. And we'll talk about it later, but it's just a fluid cavity that helps cushion the brain and then protect it, but also acts as a source for chemicals and other things that might be needed to be circulating around. And that's made by the ependymal cells. They occupy a space called the choroid plexus. That's not really important at this point, but what is important is that you understand that CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, this is really analogous to blood plasma. Of the proteins that you'd see in plasma, there'd be fewer of those in cerebrospinal fluid, but it's made kind of by the same place through the capillary exchange when you have that hydrostatic and osmotic pressure gradients there, if you remember that from general biology. The next one is known as oligodendrocytes. So oligo meaning a couple, like 10, 15. Dendrocytes, dendro meaning like processes in this case, and anything that cytes means it's a cell. And what these guys do, at least for the purposes of this class, is that they wrap these processes around the neuron fibers, around the axons. We'll talk about those mean later. And they produce this stuff known as myelin sheaths, okay? This is really important clinically because in people with multiple sclerosis, they've had damage to their myelin sheath. And what the myelin sheath does is it's basically an insulator for a nerve. And a nerve is basically just an electrical current that's running through it. So imagine if you had a wire without insulation, with that electricity would go haywire. This helps kind of make sure that whenever we have a current, it's conducting in a forward direction and it's at a very efficient rate. Myelin is a really unique fat. I think in my biochemistry videos, I made a couple of structures that I drew out the structure of sphingomyelin, which is very similar to myelin as well. Okay, so for the peripheral nervous system, okay, pen color blue, they're known as satellite cells. And we don't really know, or at least I don't really know a whole lot about satellite cells, and the literature didn't really go in much depth about it in your textbook. But what we do know is that they are analogous at the very least to astrocytes. They surround the neuron cell bodies. They do a very similar job to what we had seen with the astrocytes. This diagram here shows that it's what you're seeing here in purple. That's the satellite cells, but we think that there's other things that they may be involved in as well. I'll include some videos in this playlist. Next is Schwann cells, and Schwann cells provide regeneration to the damaged nerve fibers. So what you're seeing here is a Schwann cell, myelin sheath as well. And the difference is, whereas oligodendrocytes provided multiple coverings, Schwann cells work one at a time. So each and every one of these you see is a Schwann cell. And what makes the peripheral nervous system really interesting is that it can repair itself after it's been damaged. So you can, if you've ever broken your arm or something, you may have temporarily severed those nerves, but those nerves will grow back. You're okay with that. You can even have your arm cut off and have it surgically reattached later for the most part. And the reason that I think this is because when you look at what the peripheral nervous system does, as opposed to the central nervous system, the peripheral nerves, they don't have as nearly complicated of a job to do as central nervous system does. I mean, all that they do is fire in one direction, and that's pretty much it. They don't have to deal with, conscious thought alone is a shit ton of ATP that we're using there. And if you're using that much ATP, you're under a lot more oxidative stress. And that really, if you have a lot of oxidation, that limits the amount of regeneration that you can have. That's why humans can't really grow back limbs, whereas a plant, I can tear a plant in half, and it'll grow back, relatively speaking. But that's kind of beyond the context of this course. So for now, just know that Schwann cells, myelin sheaths, and then play a role in nerve regeneration. All right, so let's just review. Which type of neuroglia controls the extracellular fluid environment in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system? Astrocytes and Schwann cells. Hopefully that wasn't too fast. I'll probably add in a pause at the end of that video. Okay, let's try this again. Which type of neuroglia plays a role in the cerebrospinal fluid production and circulation? Pause the video if you need to. Ependymal cells.